I've known Daniel Vance the better part of 20 years, and I still say the same thing whenever somebody asks how the man who wouldn't say 10 words a day to a living soul ended up married inside of 6 weeks. It wasn't the wagon master's fault, though he took the blame for it plenty. It was a clerk with bad eyes and a ledger too small for the names crowding into it, and it was a woman who refused to be sent home just because the frontier didn't want her traveling alone. I was riding drag that spring for the Larkspur Company, which is a fancy way of saying I ate everybody's dust and counted heads at the back of 41 wagons rolling out of Millrace crossing for the Dakota Territory. Daniel scouted point. He'd done it 3 years running, ever since his wife Rebecca died of the lung fever the winter after they married, and in 3 years I never once saw him laugh the way a man laughs when nothing's chewing at him underneath. The trouble started the morning we mustered at the depot office, when a clerk named Otis Redmond, a decent fellow but blind as a post and twice as slow, ran his finger down the manifest and called out, "Vance Daniel, Vance Charlotte. Wagon 19, provisions for 2. He looked up, saw a man and a woman both step forward at the same name, and never once thought to ask if they knew each other. They didn't. Charlotte Vance had come off the eastbound stage that same hour, a carpetbag in each hand and a rifle case under one arm, headed for a ranch her late Uncle Ezra had left her out past Sorrel Hollow. She'd never met Daniel Vance in her life, but Otis had already stamped the manifest, and provisions were counted by household, and household meant 1 wagon, 1 ration of flour and salt pork and coffee, 1 canvas roof. "There's some mistake," Charlotte said, in a voice that told you right off she wasn't the type to let a mistake sit unattended. "No mistake in the book," Otis said, tapping it like scripture. "Vance and Vance, wagon 19. Company rules say I can't split a family's ration without the company agent say so, and he's gone to Fort Larimer till Thursday. Train leaves at dawn." Daniel and I was standing close enough to hear this part myself, looked at her the way a man looks at a fence he didn't build and doesn't want to climb, and said, "Ma'am, I don't know you from Sunday, and I expect you don't want to be married to a stranger any more than I want a wife I never courted. But the company's rule, not mine. We correct it Thursday." "Thursday," Charlotte said, "is 3 days after this train leaves without me, unless I'm on it as somebody's wife or somebody's daughter, and I'm neither. I've got $110 and a ranch waiting on me before the spring roundup, Mr. Vance. I don't have 3 days to spare on your rule." That was the whole of it right there, though none of us knew it yet, a clerk's small mistake, and a woman too stubborn to let it cost her a ranch. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck the way he did when he was working a thing over, and finally said the only sensible words a careful man could say. "Then I reckon we ride as Mr. and Mrs. Vance to Sorrel Hollow, and get it struck from the book the day we arrive. No claims past that. You keep to your side of the wagon, ma'am, and I'll keep to mine." She looked him over, not unkindly, just careful, the way a woman looks over a horse she's about to trust her neck to, and put out her hand. "Charlotte," she said. "Not ma'am." "Daniel," he said, and shook it like he was closing a cattle deal, and that was the whole of the wedding, such as it was. I laughed about it for a week before I understood I wasn't laughing at a joke so much as watching the first knot tied in something that would take 2 months to finish. I want to say plain, because I've heard the story get twisted in the retelling at other campfires. Nobody forced Charlotte Vance into anything, and Daniel never once treated the arrangement as anything but a fiction he was honor-bound to protect, not a claim he intended to collect on. That mattered to both of them a good deal more than the company's rule did. I watched it hold, every mile of that trail, right up until it wasn't a fiction anymore, and that part they built themselves, out of nothing the clerk's ledger gave them. We rolled out at first light the next morning, 41 wagons in a train 2 miles long when it stretched out on flat ground, and wagon 19 sat square in the middle where the wagon master liked his scouts' families, if scouts had families, which Daniel hadn't in 3 years. He drove, Charlotte rode the bench beside him with her rifle case across her knees like she expected to need it inside the hour, which, this being the frontier, and her being an unmarried woman traveling with a stranger's name pinned to her, she nearly did. The first test came before we'd made 10 miles. A widow named Prudence Oakes, who ran her tongue the way other folks ran a whip, had heard the story from Otis's wife before the ink dried, and she rode up alongside Wagon 19 at the noon stop with her chin already set for trouble. "I don't know what kind of woman marries a man she met at a depot counter," Prudence said, loud enough for 6 wagons to hear, "but I'll thank you to keep your business off the trail where decent families are traveling." Charlotte didn't flinch, and didn't look to Daniel to answer for her either, which I noticed even then. "Mrs. Oakes," she said, "I married a stranger because your company clerk decided I couldn't cross this territory alone without a man's name stamped over mine. If you've got a complaint, take it to Otis Redmond. I imagine he'd rather hear it than I would." Daniel didn't say a word in her defense. He didn't need to, and I think he understood that better than most men would have. But that evening, when Prudence Oakes tried the same complaint on him at the cook fair, he answered it in 4 words and never raised his voice. "My wife speaks for herself." It wasn't tenderness, not yet. It was a fence line, drawn plain, and Charlotte heard it from 20 feet off and said nothing, but I saw her shoulders come down half an inch, like a woman setting down a weight she hadn't known she was carrying since the depot. That was the shape of the first week. Small kindnesses mistaken for nothing but manners, small defenses mistaken for nothing but a bargain kept. Daniel taught her to load and fire the rifle she'd been carrying more for show than use, because a woman alone on the frontier who couldn't defend herself was a woman other men would test, married name or not. He didn't do it gentle. He did it the way he did everything, plain and thorough, walking her through the load, the sight, the kick of it against her shoulder, correcting her grip without apology and without unkindness either. "You're anticipating the kick," he told her, the 3rd evening, when she flinched a half-second before she pulled the trigger and put a shot 2 feet wide of the cottonwood stump they were using for a mark. "Anticipating it makes you miss. Trust the gun to do what it does, and just point it true." "That's a fine philosophy for a man who isn't holding it," Charlotte said, but she squared up again, and this time held steady and put the shot dead center and looked so startled by her own aim that Daniel, I saw this myself, from 20 paces off, tending my own horse, nearly smiled. Nearly. It didn't quite arrive, but it was closer than I'd seen him come in 3 years, and I filed it away the way a man files away weather signs, wondering what it meant. The river came on the 9th day, and it was the first place the fiction bent hard enough that neither of them could pretend it was only paperwork anymore. The company had counted on fording the Coldwater at a shallow crossing 2 days out from Millrace, but 3 weeks of spring melt had swelled it into something meaner than the maps allowed, brown and fast and higher than any of our wheels wanted to sit in. The wagon master called for a slow crossing, 1 wagon at a time, ropes strung bank to bank, every driver walking his team through by hand rather than trusting the current to a set of reins. Wagon 19 went 11th in line. Daniel walked the lead ox himself, chest deep in cold water that would have dropped a lesser man's breath clean out of him, and Charlotte sat the bench holding the brake in the second team's lines, exactly as he'd told her to. It went fine until a wheel found a hole nobody'd sounded, and the wagon lurched hard enough to throw her forward against the brake bar, and the whole rig canted sideways with the current pulling at it like a hand trying to drag it downstream. I was 2 wagons back and saw the moment plain. Charlotte grabbing for the seat rail to keep from going into the water, the rifle case sliding off her knees and gone in the current before she could catch it, and Daniel, waist deep, rope in one fist, ox lead in the other, letting go of both without a second's hesitation, and coming back around the wagon's high side to get a hand under her arm before the next lurch could finish what the first one started. "I have you," he said, and I heard it clear across the water, not loud, just certain, the kind of certain a man only sounds when he's not thinking about the words at all. "I have you, Charlotte. Hold to me." She held. The wagon righted itself with the two teams straining together once Daniel got the lead ox back in hand, and they made the far bank soaked through and shaking with cold but whole. The rifle was gone downstream, lost for good, and Charlotte cried about it that night at the fire, not for the rifle itself, she told me later, but because it had been her Uncle Ezra's, the one thing of his she'd carried the whole way, and now it was gone before she'd even seen the ranch it was meant to guard. Daniel sat with her a long while that night, past when the rest of the camp had banked its fires and gone quiet. I wasn't eavesdropping. A man can't help what carries across a hushed camp, but I heard enough to know it was the first time either of them had said anything true to the other that didn't have the trail's business wrapped around it. "I lost people to rivers before," Daniel said low. "Not this one. My wife Rebecca, she didn't die in water. Fever took her, the winter after we married, before we'd even finished building the house I promised her. I keep thinking if I'd built faster, if I'd had her somewhere warm and dry sooner." He stopped there, the way a man stops when he said more than he meant to. "You can't outbuild a fever," Charlotte said quiet. "I know that kind of thinking. I spent a year telling myself if I'd been prettier or more agreeable or less myself, Thomas wouldn't have called off the wedding 2 weeks before it, once he heard what kind of life a rancher's wife out here actually leads. Woke me up plenty of nights, that kind of thinking. Never once got me anywhere but tired." "What got you here then?" Daniel said, "if not that?" "Ezra did," she said. "He wrote me every month for 6 years and never once told me the ranch was hard, or the winters were long, or a woman alone would draw every kind of trouble a territory's got to offer. Just told me it was mine whenever I wanted it, and that he thought I'd be good at it. Nobody'd told me I'd be good at anything in a long while. I wasn't going to let a clerk's mistake take that away from me, and I surely wasn't going to let a river do it either." I don't know what passed between them after that, because I turned in myself not long after, but I know something had shifted because the next morning Daniel Vance, a man who hadn't smiled at anything in 3 years by my count, handed Charlotte a spare pistol from his own kit without a word of instruction needed, because she'd already learned everything he had to teach her, and said only, "Company can't take that one. It's mine to give." It wasn't a gift a man gives a stranger he's minding out of obligation. We both knew it, even if neither of them said so yet. The trouble that tested it hardest came 11 days later, past the halfway mark, when a drover named Silas Prout, hired on late at a way station to help with the stock, and hired on foolish, as it turned out, decided a woman traveling under another man's name but sharing his fire every night must not think much of the arrangement, and might welcome better company. He caught Charlotte alone at the creek one evening, filling water pails, and put himself between her and the camp in a way that wasn't accidental. "Heard your marriage is a paper one," Prout said, smiling the kind of smile that thinks itself charming. "Heard Vance keeps to his own side of the wagon. Man'd have to be a fool, a woman like you sleeping 10 feet off and him not once." "You heard wrong about the kind of man he is," Charlotte said, stepping sideways to keep the water pails between them. "And you're about to learn wrong about the kind of woman I am, if you don't step back from my creek." He didn't step back. He caught her wrist instead, not hard enough to bruise but hard enough to mean something, and that was as far as it got, because Daniel had come looking for her when she hadn't returned from the creek in the time he'd expected, and I was 10 paces behind him, and we both arrived to find Prout's hand still closed on her arm and Charlotte's face gone to a kind of cold fury that would have stopped a smarter man cold on its own. Daniel didn't shout. I want that understood because the story gets told rougher than it happened sometimes, with fists and gunplay that never occurred. What happened was this. Daniel walked between them, put his own body square in the space Prout had been crowding, and said, in a voice I'd only heard him use once before, the day he buried Rebecca, "Take your hand off my wife." Prout let go, Whether it was the word wife or the look on Daniel's face that did it, I couldn't say, but he backed off 2 full steps before he found his voice again. Didn't mean nothing by it, he said. Heard the marriage wasn't a real one is all. It's real enough that you'll answer to me if you're anywhere near her again, Daniel said. Ask the wagon master how real. He'll tell you I don't say things twice. Pruitt was let go from the company 2 days later, officially for drink, though everybody in camp knew the truer reason, and Charlotte didn't say much about the whole business afterward except one thing. That same night, sitting close to the fire with a blanket around her shoulders, Daniel had put there without being asked. You didn't have to do that, she said. Say what you said. A man protecting a woman he's minding out of duty doesn't call her his wife to a man like Pruitt. He just says leave her be. Daniel was quiet a long moment, turning a coffee cup in his hands like it required careful study. I know, he said finally. I said it anyway. I've been turning over why for 2 days, and I haven't found an answer that isn't the plain one. Which is I've stopped thinking of you as a fiction to protect, Charlotte, and started thinking of you as somebody I don't want anything happening to. That's not the arrangement we made at Mill Race. I know it isn't. I'm not asking you to answer for it. I just didn't want to keep pretending I hadn't noticed the difference. She didn't answer him that night, not with words. But she didn't move her chair back to her own side of the fire either, and I took that for the answer it was, and left the 2 of them to their coffee and their quiet, because some things a man witnesses and some things he leaves be, and that was the second kind. The weeks after that softened into something neither of them tried too hard to name. Charlotte took to riding scout with Daniel some mornings instead of keeping the wagon bench, learning the country the way he read it, where the grass thinned and told you water was close, where a line of cottonwoods meant a creek worth trusting, where buffalo wallows meant old herds and older trails. Daniel, for his part, started keeping his trail ledger different. He'd always logged miles and rations in a small worn book, careful entries in a careful hand, a habit from his freighting days, he told her, when a man's whole living depended on knowing exactly what he'd spent and exactly what remained. Somewhere past the Coldwater crossing, the ledger started holding other things too. Not love notes, Daniel Vance wasn't built for love notes, but small true facts, the kind a careful man records because he doesn't trust himself to remember them any other way. Charlotte prefers her coffee black and too strong for most tastes. Charlotte laughed today at the company mule that outran its own harness. First time in 3 years I've heard a laugh worth writing down. I know what the ledger held because he showed me himself. Years later, the winter he finally admitted how much of that trail he'd spent talking himself out of what was plainly true. But even without the ledger, any fool riding drag behind Wagon 19 for 6 weeks could have read the same story and how they sat the bench together, closer each week, without either one seeming to notice the distance closing, the way water finds its level without asking permission. There was a night, past the 3-week mark, when a storm caught the train exposed on open ground with no timber for shelter and lightning enough to spook every animal in the company. Daniel got Charlotte into the wagon bed and lashed the canvas down himself before he went to help settle the stock, and by the time he came back, drenched through and half frozen, she'd already built what shelter the wagon allowed and was waiting with a blanket and a hard look that told him to sit down and stop being noble about it. You'll take fever standing out in that, she said. And then where will Sorrel Hollow be, one dead scout short of the man it's counting on? Didn't figure you for the worrying type, Daniel said, but he sat and let her get the wet coat off him, and didn't argue when she wrapped the blanket around them both because the wagon bed wasn't built for 2 people keeping careful distance in a storm that shook the canvas like a thing alive. I worry about what's mine to worry about, Charlotte said. Fell out that way somewhere on this trail, didn't plan it. Woke up one morning past the river and found I already had. That a confession, Charlotte Vance? Might be. Depends what you're offering in trade, Daniel Vance, before I commit to it fully. He was quiet a moment, the storm loud around them, and when he spoke his voice had none of the careful distance he'd kept for 3 years since Rebecca. "I'm offering that I don't want Thursday at the company office to be the day this arrangement ends. I'm offering that a fiction I meant to hold 4 days out of honor, I've been holding 6 weeks out of something I don't have a smaller word for than love, and I'd rather say that plain to you now, storm or no storm, than keep pretending I'm only being neighborly. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. The trail's not done, and I won't have you deciding anything out of gratitude for a blanket." "I've been deciding it a while myself," Charlotte said. "Longer than you'd guess, if the ledger you think I don't know about is any evidence." Daniel went very still at that, and she laughed, a real laugh, warm despite the storm, and it undid something in him I'd swear I could see loosen even from my memory of the story he told me after. "I saw a page once, fetching your kit for the river crossing. Didn't mean to read it. Couldn't stop myself once I had. A man doesn't write down another woman's coffee preference in a ledger he keeps for freight rates unless something in him's already decided, Daniel, whatever his mouth's still working up the nerve to say." Neither of them said the rest of it that night. Some things a storm's noise is a mercy for, letting two careful people find their way toward each other without every word having to carry weight in the open air. But I know, because Daniel told me himself years on, that it was the night he stopped thinking of Sorrel Hollow as the place their fiction would end, and started thinking of it as the place a real thing might begin, if the territory and its laws would let it. The territory nearly didn't. We came down into Sorrel Hollow on the 41st day, the ranch country opening up green and wide below the last ridge the way good land always does, like the earth itself is glad to show you what it's kept in reserve. Ezra Vance's spread sat along a creek at the valley's north end, a solid house and a barn gone soft with 2 winters' neglect since his passing, and it should have been the easiest thing in the world for Charlotte to walk into the land office at Sorrel Hollow's one dusty street and claim what her uncle's will had left her outright. It wasn't, because a man named Cornelius Redding had gotten there first with a different idea. Redding ran the territorial land office at Sorrel Hollow and ran a good deal else besides. Quietly, the way men do who have learned that a signature carries more weight than a gun in country too new for its own courts to be fully trusted. He'd had his eye on Ezra Vance's water rights for 2 years before the old man died, and he'd spent the months since working out exactly how a lone woman's claim might be challenged on a technicality the law hadn't quite caught up to yet, namely, that the territory's homestead provisions, written by men who never imagined a woman inheriting land outright, required a claim be held by a person, and where married, that person's spouse jointly, and left murky enough room around unmarried women that a determined clerk with a friendly judge could stall a claim for months on the question alone. "Nothing personal in it, Miss Vance," Redding said, when Charlotte presented Ezra's will at his office the morning after we arrived, Daniel standing at her shoulder and me lingering by the door because something in Daniel's face told me he might need a witness before the morning was through. "The will's plain enough on its face. But a single woman holding water rights this valuable, out here alone with no husband to answer for the claim if it's contested. I'd be doing you a disservice not to flag it for the circuit judge's review. Could take the better part of a year to clear, with the right questions asked. Meantime the land sits fallow, and fallow land in this territory has a way of reverting to open claim." It was a threat dressed up as caution, and every soul in the room knew it, Redding most of all. Charlotte's hand had gone tight on the will's edge, and I watched her work through the arithmetic of it the way she'd worked through everything else on that trail, fast and without panic, but with the particular fury of a woman watching a man try to take by paperwork what he couldn't take honestly. "The will names me outright," she said. "Ezra Vance's own hand, witnessed and notarized in Millrace Crossing." "The will's not in question," Redding said, smooth as creek water. "The territory's homestead provision is. I'd hate to see good land sit idle a year over a technicality, Miss Vance. There's a simpler road, if you'd consider it. My own claim borders the North Creek. A joint filing between us would clear the whole question inside a week, and I expect we could come to terms that suited us both. There it was, plain as Redding could make it without saying the word outright, marry me. Or watch the land you crossed a territory for choke on red tape for a year while I starve you into the bargain I actually want. I've seen a lot of frontier cruelty dressed up in a banker's coat over the years, and that morning ranks among the coldest, precisely because Redding never raised his voice once. Daniel stepped forward before Charlotte could answer, and I want to set down exactly what he said, because it's the part of the story folks get wrong most often, imagining he swept in and rescued her the way a man rescues a woman who can't rescue herself. That wasn't it. Charlotte Vance had already opened her mouth to answer Redding on her own terms, and I believe to this day she'd have found her way through it regardless. What Daniel did was simpler, and it mattered more for being freely given rather than forced. The homestead provision you're citing requires a spouse where one exists, Daniel said. One does. Miss Vance and I have been traveling as husband and wife since Millrace Crossing, on the Larkspur Company's own manifest. 6 weeks now with 40 travelers who'll swear to it under oath if your circuit judge wants witnesses. You want to contest the claim on marital grounds, Mr. Redding. You'll be contesting a marriage that's already a matter of record, not offering one that isn't. It was true, on the paper if nowhere else yet, and Redding knew it, and his smooth face went a shade less smooth, working out how thin a thread he had left to pull. But he wasn't wrong to press on it either, because a manifest entry made by a careless clerk wasn't the same as a marriage a judge would recognize as real if Redding chose to push the question that far, and everyone in that office understood the gap between the two. That was when Charlotte turned to Daniel, not to Redding, not to me, but to Daniel, and asked the only question that mattered in front of a man who tried to buy her land with her own desperation. Daniel Vance, she said, I've spent 6 weeks married to you on a clerk's mistake, and I find I don't want it corrected. I'm not asking on account of Mr. Redding's paperwork. I'm asking because a river crossing back near the Coldwater and a storm 3 weeks past that taught me something about you a depot ledger never could. Will you marry me for real, in front of a preacher, on my own choosing and not the territory's? And let Mr. Redding's provision be a fact he has to live with rather than a trap he set for me. I've never in my life seen Daniel Vance move as fast as he did crossing that small office to take her hands, and I've never heard his voice as certain as it was saying, I was going to ask you myself the first quiet evening we found after Sorrel Hollow, Charlotte, and I'd have asked whether Redding existed or not. Yes. God, yes. Redding tried once more, weak by then, to raise some question about the marriage's timing relative to the will's filing, but the Sorrel Hollow preacher, a plain-spoken old circuit rider named Reverend Micah Holt, who'd married half the valley and buried the other half and had no patience left for land office chicanery, married them himself that same afternoon properly, with the whole train and half the valley's settled families crowded into the little church to witness it, and told Redding to his face afterward that he'd sign no false papers over a claim that clean, and that Redding's own dealings might bear closer looking into than Ezra Vance's nieces ever would. Redding didn't trouble Charlotte's claim again. Word travels fast in small valleys, and a man's reputation for cornering desperate women doesn't survive long once it's spoken plain in front of a church full of witnesses. I stood up with Daniel that afternoon, the closest thing to family he had in the territory, and I'll tell you honestly it's the only wedding I've ever attended where the groom couldn't stop smiling long enough to get his vows out clean the first try, and had to ask the reverend's patience to say them twice. They built the house up from Ezra's old bones that first summer, added a room, mended the barn, ran cattle on grass Ezra had always sworn was the best in the valley and never once exaggerated about. I rode out to see them most seasons for years after, long after I'd left the company and settled my own small spread 2 valleys over. And I never once saw Daniel Vance's ledger without some new true fact recorded in that same careful hand. Not freight rates anymore, not miles and rations, but the ordinary treasures of a life he'd stopped believing he'd get a second chance at. Charlotte planted roses along the porch this spring. Charlotte laughed at supper tonight, the real kind, the kind I used to think I'd buried with Rebecca. I asked him once, years on, sitting on that same porch with his and Charlotte's second child asleep against his shoulder, whether he ever resented the clerk at Millrace Crossing for the mix-up that started it all. A man's whole life rerouted by another man's tired eyes, and a ledger too crowded for the names in it. Daniel looked out over the creek a long while before he answered, the way he always did when a thing mattered enough to get right. "Resent him," he said. "I've half a mind to write him a letter of thanks every year on our anniversary. Man spent 30 years stamping manifests nobody remembers, and one tired afternoon he wrote 2 strangers' names side by side and called it a family before either of us had the sense to see it coming. I've stopped believing that was only his mistake to make, Emmett. Some things get written down true before the people they're written about have caught up to them." I didn't argue him on it. I'd watched the whole of it happen, mile by mile, from a clerk's careless stamp to a porch with roses on it and a boy asleep in his father's arms. And if that isn't a kind of grace working itself out slow and patient across a hard stretch of territory, I don't know a better name to call it by.